Just make sure you don't turn into a white nationalist. They flood channels like ours and demand respect. But don't let that scare you, because in the end, white nationalists really aren't all that bad, even though I fundamentally disagree with them. So lazy, oh lazy.
Praising.
Identitarian is the word that's been buzzing around lately, and we see alt-right and nationalist groups using it more and more, like Identity Europa in the US or Generation Identity in Western Europe. We also see the skeptic crowd beginning to use this word in a more counter-identitarian or anti-identitarian kind of way, including Sargon himself, who has added this term to his Twitter bio. And in Sargon's case, at least, I think he's being a bit disingenuous when he uses this word. When it comes to groups like Generation Identity, they are using the term in the context of ethnic, cultural, and national identity. They are concerned with preserving the foundational aspects of what makes their home their home. When they say identity, they are referring to a multifaceted concept of their ethnic ancestry, language, religion, food, art, the tangible fixtures and traditions that distinguish their nation and people from other nations and peoples. For lack of a better word, they're referring to something that is real. When Sargon uses the word identity or identitarian, he's using it in a much more broad sense, not just to refer to nationalists or the alt-right and their concerns, but also to refer to social justice phenomena like genderqueer or non-binary or Latinx, things which aren't really based in historical, cultural, or ethnic fixtures. They're not really based in anything. They're postmodernist perversions of identity. As an illustration of the difference, let's compare Latinx identity to actual Latino identity. Go ahead and ask an actual Latino person you know what they think of Latinx identity. Chances are that they'll be repulsed by it. The Spanish language is heavily gendered, and so an attempt to remove such a pervasive characteristic seems like a slap in the face to them. It's understandable why they'd find it disgusting. Language is a perfect example of what would serve as a component for the more tangible characteristics of identity that I mentioned a few moments ago. It informs their interactions with other members of their group, their sense of humor, their folklore, everything about them. I find it hard to believe that Sargon doesn't understand this, and I'm puzzled by his attempts to pull the wool over people's eyes by trying to ignore identity entirely, as a way to contend with all of his opponents at once. We have to admit that some identities are more real than others. Another perfect example of this is a recent Twitter exchange Sargon had with Francesca Ramsey, in which he asks her what she means by her blackness. She responds by saying she's not interested in engaging him, and frankly, I don't really blame her for reacting that way to such a banal question. Why do Black Americans feel solidarity with each other? Why do they feel that they have a group identity? Well, let's be honest, it's because of their history in America. There's no way around it. Black Americans experienced a shared history which defined them as a particular group, distinct from other Americans, and as regrettable as this history may be, it is real, but all the moral questions of it are besides the point, which is that this is the reason why they recognize the shared identity. It makes sense for them to behave tribally and to have in-group preference, which is why they consistently and overwhelmingly vote for the Democratic Party, for instance. This is the party that makes them promises and claims it will act in their political interests. And this is just one example. Jews, as an ethno-religious group, are another good example of this. Jews have a long history of not being accepted in virtually any society they've ever inhabited. It makes perfect sense for them to behave tribally and for individual Jews to acknowledge that they're a part of a greater collective with particular interests, and for the individual Jew to act in those collective interests on those grounds. Zionism is, in itself, an obvious form of identitarianism or Jewish nationalism. This is why I believe that the term identitarian is a better term than white nationalist. Identitarianism can and does apply to every group of people. Now, I think MouthyBuddha does a great job of highlighting the conversational deficit which is present in the skeptic community. Although he obviously doesn't agree, he is at least trying to present the subject in a charitable and honest way. As for Sargon, well, obviously I don't think he's stupid or totally uninformed. He's simply trying to attack the problem through the lens of individualism.
And it's not just on the left, it's always also on the right. The alt-right are an identitarian movement. Classical liberalism is not an identitarian movement, and it's hard to fight against identity politics. especially when the premise that the left comes with is that white people cannot have an identity. And I mean, I don't want to see white identitarianism rise. I don't like identitarianism of any stripe.
Virtually everything he's said and done to this point, every take that he's given against the social justice movement, has been characterized by a pure focus on the individual. And since identitarianism and nationalism are forms of collectivism, the only way these concepts can fit into Sargon's narrative is for him to oppose them and paint them as inherently hostile to the individual. From the tactical standpoint of preserving his base, I understand why Sargon is doing this, but I don't believe that he's doing it in earnest. He must know that this is the direction things are headed in.
Now, the reality is this, that these population changes are going to happen, whether Mo Ansar, whether Martin Sellner, whether anybody else likes it or not. So we need to decide how we want to live in the future. We need to find a way that is well integrated. We have policies of integration. People who are anti-multiculturalists and anti-globalists and anti-Islam and all the usual kind of hate and hysteria we hear from the far right nowadays, they want to create a world of division, of walls and boundaries. And the people I hang about with, the people I speak to, the people I meet when I do my music and my politics and my activism, the people I meet, they want less walls and they want more bridges. They want us to build connections between communities. They want us to embrace change. And in fact, every time Europe has embraced civilizational change, and we are at a civilizational crossroads, there's been a great enlightenment. So I'd invite Martin to join the cause. I'd ask him to become more enlightened.
He knows that he's not going to convince black people or Latinos or Jews or Muslims or anyone else to forfeit their identity to the extent that is necessary for his worldview and policies to work. To provide an example of Sargon's recognition of social cohesion as a political factor, I would point you to this short clip from a Thinkery video called The Final Nail, in which Sargon says,
Putin's a terrible man as an individual. He is a terrible man. He keeps murdering journalists, he keeps murdering the opposition, and he has expansionist plans. But that's actually better than it could have been if you think about the sort of leaders Russia produces. What do you expect to come out of Russia? A multi-ethnic authoritarian state. Are you thinking you're ever going to see a liberal Russian prime minister? Because I have some fucking news for you. You won't.
A multi-ethnic authoritarian state.
Why would that matter? Why would it be relevant that Russia is multi-ethnic? You know what's even more multi-ethnic than Russia? The United States. In the industrialized first world, it doesn't get much more multi-ethnic than the United States. Why would Sargon mention this if he doesn't actually understand how diversity plays into social cohesion? And what about the video he did on the parallels between the history of Rome and the present-day United States?
Welcome to the stage for your civil war, America. I wonder who your Marius and Sulla will be. This is all the product of political forces, which in themselves are a product of people's interests.
Oh, people's interests, you say. In this video, Sargon characterizes these political forces and interests purely in terms of socioeconomic status, but again, we can see these motivations playing out along racial and ethnic lines. As we all know, a common talking point of the American left is that whites are privileged by their socioeconomic status, while non-whites, primarily blacks, are underprivileged and exploited by the privilege of whites. The entire issue is framed in racial and ethnic terms, and there's simply no way around the facts of who pays into the system the most and who receives the most from it.
The United States federal government does not have tax revenue broken down by race. However, we can get a pretty good idea of what it is based on what data is publicly available. First, we know how much each tax bracket in the United States pays in taxes. Second, we know the racial distribution into each tax bracket, and so it's very simple math. Now the next question is, how much government does each group use? And contrary to a lot of people's expectations, this part isn't really going to matter much. The overwhelming majority of government is not going to differ between the races. Blacks and Hispanics use more income security, Medicare and Medicaid more. Whites use Social Security more, if I recall correctly. And so there's some discrepancy in government use. Hispanics and blacks do use welfare more, but the big effects here are going to come from differential tax payments. And in 2014, the net budgetary effect was around negative $10,000 per black person, negative $7,300 per Hispanic, and positive $2,800 per white person. But that's assigning blacks and Hispanics their own cut of military spending. Let's, just as a thought experiment, assign 100% of military spending to whites. With this static military assumption, the whites are still net taxpayers of $1,260, Blacks, negative 7,700. Hispanics, negative 5,160. So even assigning 100% of military spending to whites, this was about $603 billion a year in 2014. So diversity is really expensive.
The left is not exactly wrong when they say that the Republican Party, or the right wing, is the white people's party. For all intents and purposes, it kind of is. So clearly, Sargon has some level of understanding of this, yet simultaneously seems to find ease in writing it off in favor of his individualistic mindset. I think this may be in part due to his upbringing and the environment he lives in. Sargon has mentioned in the past that he lives in Swindon, England, which is fairly distant from London and is an overwhelmingly white British town. I myself grew up in an overwhelmingly white suburb of Chicago, and I barely gave a thought to any of these issues until young adulthood, when I lived in the city itself for a period of time. The difference in social cohesion and levels of trust was like night and day, and there were certain areas of the city I simply didn't travel through because I knew there was an increased personal risk attached to those areas. Indeed, Chicago is an extremely segregated city, to the point where you can observe the division in terms as specific as city blocks. So after witnessing this for myself, it became difficult to deny ethnic identity as an element of real-life politics, and until fairly recently, London was a majority white British city. I last visited in 2009, not that long ago, and traveling all over the city didn't yield the same kind of experiences I had living in Chicago. I'm not sure that would be true now, but even today, the United Kingdom simply does not have the level of diversity the United States has. They're only getting their first real taste of it. So while I do believe Sargon understands what identity means in the context of ethnocultural and national groups, he doesn't quite understand what diversity is actually like in practice. And now we come to the matter of Rage After Storm's video. Buddha is absolutely right to point out the poor quality of the Worski stream given in response. Proud & T is the only person there who's made any credible, sincere effort to argue against identitarians and nationalism. The rest, as Buddha notes, are either trying to attack the issue via the same old ponage tactic they would have used against bedroom feminists, or are simply engaging in denial of the subject entirely. I'm no expert on the subject of measuring intelligence, but the idea of individual people on YouTube who are themselves as lacking in expertise as those they're criticizing being able to make that judgment simply doesn't hold up to examination of the world around us.
People don't want to hear that intelligence is a real thing, and that some people have more of it than others. They don't want to hear that IQ tests really measure it. They don't want to hear that differences in IQ matter, because they're highly predictive of differential success in life. And not just for things like educational attainment and wealth, but for things like out-of-wedlock birth and mortality. People don't want to hear that a person's intelligence is in large measure due to his or her genes, and that there seems to be very little we can do environmentally to increase a person's intelligence.
You could say that IQ is what's common across all possible sets of intelligence tests. Now, people are going to debate that because you still have to define what constitutes a test. But the way the psychometricians have managed it, and have taken care of this at least to some degree, is to say, well, we're not going to define everything that we measure as intelligence. So extroverted people are more socially fluent. Are we going to call that intelligence? No. We're going to call that personality. We're going to call that extroversion. And we're going to call stress tolerance. You could say, well, if you can tolerate more stress, you're more intelligent. It's like, well, no, that isn't how we've defined it. We're going to define that as being lower in neuroticism. If you're cooperative, you're more intelligent. That's emotional intelligence. Well, what? You're less intelligent if you're competitive? Well, no. So we've parsed that off to agreeableness. So then the question might be, is there anything left of these so-called intelligences once you control for personality and IQ? And the answer is no. Nothing. Nothing left of them. And the people who keep pushing these ideas keep trying to push them because they don't like the idea of real individual differences. And to me, that's just a matter of sticking your damn head in the sand, because it's obvious. Here, you're going to have a child. You want the child to have an IQ of 65 or 145. Decide. Okay, so you're all going to vote. Okay, you think any one of you is going to vote to have a child with an IQ of 65. That child's going to have a hard time developing even linguistic ability. They're never going to learn to read, right? They're never going to leave home, in all likelihood. So which child are you going to pick? Well, so do you believe in intelligence or not? Well, obviously, if you have any sense.
Expert opinion on this subject absolutely has not formed a consensus that intelligence can't be measured or isn't a real thing. As Buddha points out, engaging low-hanging fruit will not make this discussion go away. Now, this point is where we're really going to disagree.
Talking about SJWs is over. We won. And as rational centrists, as cultural libertarians, classical liberals, as conservatives, the time has come to pick on those our own size. And I can assure you, this will be much more difficult than making fun of feminists.
From what I've seen of MouthyBuddha, he seems like someone worth having a discussion with, but on this particular point, I'm sorry, you sound completely delusional. The SJWs, or the progressive left, or the social justice movement, whatever you would like to call them, have not been defeated by any means whatsoever. Not even close. The recent CNN blackmail debacle is an illustration of this. The progressive left and social justice activists have an enormous structural advantage over those opposed to them. CNN is just one media company, and the story is the same at a multitude of other media companies, many of which actually praised and defended CNN's actions. As I mentioned in my first video on this channel, we are dealing with a pervasive narrative machine, which includes the news media, the entertainment media, social media, the academic institutions, and parts of our own governments. All across Western Europe, restrictions on speech are tightening. I'm not saying this to be rude, but I don't know how else to put it. To declare victory at this point, just because anti-SJWs pwned some low-hanging fruit on YouTube, is totally out of touch. The reality of the situation is that we are all staring down the barrel of the same gun. And I say we tentatively. From the nationalists and the alt-right all the way to the more basic type of anti-feminist or anti-SJW commentator, regardless of where you are on that spectrum, we are all targets of the same political and cultural force that seeks to silence us. We don't have the footing to make such a declaration of victory, and unfortunately for the skeptic crowd, they are routinely lumped in with the alt-right by the progressive left, whether they like it or not. There's still a lot more work to be done, and it has to become real-world resistance to these institutions. Complaining on the internet is only going to be effective to a certain point, and we appear to have reached that point. I mean, say what you want about Richard Spencer. In my opinion, he's severely underutilizing his wealth, resources, and connections, and seems to be seeking notoriety more than anything else. He could be doing a much better job of representing alt-right or identitarian ideas. However, regardless of whatever valid criticisms one might make of him, he has objectively done more for free speech than the skeptic community has. When Auburn University tried to cancel a speaking engagement they had scheduled with Spencer, he took them to court and won, setting a precedent for future cases of this nature. And if you don't like Spencer's rhetoric about peaceful ethnic cleansing, well, guess who made the exact same argument regarding the survival interests of a certain tribe of people? In 2003, Shapiro penned an article for townhall.com called "Transfer is Not a Dirty Word." Quote, "Here's the bottom line. If you believe that the Jewish state has a right to exist, then you must allow Israel to transfer the Palestinians and Israeli Arabs from Judea, Samaria, Gaza, and Israel proper. It's an ugly solution, but it's the only solution, and it's far less ugly than the prospect of bloody conflict ad infinitum. When two populations are constantly enmeshed in conflict, it is insane to suggest that somehow deep-seated ideological change will miraculously occur, allowing the two sides to live together." And the thing I find funniest about this is that Shapiro even specifically references the post-World War II remigration of people in Europe, similar to Spencer's invocation of the Paris Peace Conference after World War I. This is about as far as I'm willing to defend Spencer at this point, but you have to admit, it's pretty much the exact same argument. When America becomes Brazil 2.0, I wonder which country Ben Shapiro is going to pledge allegiance to. Anyway, moving on. As I'm sure Buddha is well aware of by now, many in the skeptic crew, both viewers and creators themselves, seem to be unwilling to take the discussion beyond making YouTube videos and talking about Ma individualism. And at the end of the day, this is a collective force that we're up against. It can't be beaten by being individuals at it. You say that saving the West doesn't necessitate joining the alt-right, whatever that really means. It's not so much a proper organized movement as it is a sentiment. This it shares in common with the skeptic crowd. Perhaps joining is the wrong way of characterizing it, but if you're sincere when you say things like,
I grant you that whites are worthy of preserving and that the general trajectory is of whites dying out. I also grant you that this is a net negative for Western civilization. But what I am exclaiming to so many of you on the alt-right is that we can find more practical and ethical solutions to these problems in a unified nationalism, in drastically reducing immigration. Now, I'm all for free association if you would like to wall off a zone and live as whites and whites only. I think you should be free to do this.
Then there's really no one else for you to align with in the aim of achieving that except for us. It's certainly true, like any other political or ideological group, that the alt-right has its share of emotionally reactive people. I'm sure some portion of those dislikes on your videos came from emotionally reactive alt-righters, but I'm just as sure that another portion came from emotionally reactive skeptics who didn't like that you were trying to be charitable to the nationalists.
Something I was not expecting that really did surprise me was how hard the pushback was from those who would appear to be on my side of the street, with many saying I am making a mistake by adopting race realism as a reasonable approach when discussing racial differences, or that racial differences even exist, or that I'm granting too much validity to the alt-right by addressing them at all.
And although you did get some harsh and LARPy feedback in the comments section, the more polite and reasonable comments you got from alt-righters were also the ones that got the most thumbs up. Interesting how you didn't focus on those. Although I believe most of your criticism was in good faith, that's the kind of thing that you don't do in good faith, and I was a little disappointed by your second video because of that. My estimation is this: most of the skeptics are unwilling to properly engage nationalism or identitarianism in any direct or meaningful way. Those who would rather dismiss are going to turn on people like you who are willing to engage, in part because you accept several of the alt-right's claims about reality and human nature, as does our friend Jordan B. Peterson.
Do you think this core belief of the alt-right is flawed? Is it laudable? Is it reprehensible? Or?
It's incomplete. It's incomplete. I mean, it's identification with the Father, and that's necessary. But the purpose of identification with the Father is to become the Son, right? And I mean that in all of its symbolic manifestation. And the problem with nationalism is that it forgets that. It forgets that the purpose of the nation is to give rise to the individual. And what's happened now, because our identities have become fragmented, is that there's a call to reconstitute the Father. And that's at the core of the alt-right thinking. Well, that's the benevolent part of the alt-right. I mean, there's a downside, there's a negative side to everything. I mean, one of the things that's quite disturbing about the alt-right is its continual proclivity to degenerate into anti-Semitism. And I see that in the comments, for example, on my videos continually. So it's oversimplified. And there's also no true recognition, or not sufficient recognition, that the state is also a pathological monster. It's the basis of the alt-right's criticism of the left. The alt-right says the left is always trying to expand the dominion of the state, and the state is a pathological monster. Yet what we should do is become nationalists. It's like, sorry guys, there's a bit of a paradox there. It's not surprising, and as long as the radical left keeps pushing the way they keep pushing, then the alt-right is going to continue to grow.
My personal problem with the left is not simply that they want to expand the dominion of the state. It depends how the state expands and to what end. I'm against the left's restriction of dissenting thought and speech, against their weaponization of social programs, their propagation of affirmative action policies in universities and workplaces, their efforts to force diversity on communities which are deemed too homogenous or too white, and their varying degrees of apathy and or open hostility towards white people by members of leftist political parties. But if you were to suggest to me that we should have strong national borders and strict immigration policy, yes, I would absolutely like to expand the dominion of the state. Conversely, if you were to suggest that we have proper free association, which means freedom to discriminate as much as it means freedom to associate, I would be in favor of limiting the government's power to impose association. I strongly reject the libertarian notion of the state as a monolithic entity which can only get larger or smaller in broad generalized terms. It's not an either-or proposition. It depends what the state is doing and for what purpose. Although I tend to favor authority and I consider hierarchy to be a fundamental aspect of human behavior, one that should be embraced, I am not in favor of totalitarianism. I don't want a government that controls every aspect of people's lives. I want a government strong enough to do its job, but restrained enough to do it properly. This does not entail a small or big government, just the right government. Secondly, regarding the point on the purpose of a nation being to give rise to the individual, I actually completely agree with this sentiment. I don't consider myself myself an individualist or a collectivist. In fact, I consider this to be a false and worthless dichotomy. Recognizing and accounting for trends of behavior amongst groups doesn't mean I must therefore approve or reject all individuals I encounter on that basis. If I were locked in a room with that guy T, John Oliver, and a loaded gun, there'd be no question. Oliver gets the bullet. But this ability to get along and appreciate people on an individual basis does not change the reality of the aforementioned group behavior, and it is arguable that the reason why American society is now failing to give rise to the individual is precisely because of the levels of diverse tribalism endemic in our social framework. An academic called Robert Putnam has written extensively on this issue, and his own research actually gave him pause as a leftist. He waited years to publish his findings because it was difficult for him to reconcile them with his worldview. Putnam's research found that across the board, in virtually all metrics of social cohesion and quality of life, greater diversity equated to less communal participation, less cooperation, and generally lower levels of reported happiness when compared to more homogeneous communities and societies. Without an overarching cohesive identity, there is nothing to give rise to the individual. There's no reference point or baseline to judge individual differences from, because the nation as a whole does not have an identity. It has many fragmented identities, as Peterson himself states, which butt up against one another, unless of course you can convince enough people to ignore the ethnic and cultural subgroups they've collectivized themselves in and act purely as individuals in a vacuum. One could imagine this as sort of being the ultimate diversity of the individual, with nothing really connecting any of them together. So I want to close off by asking one question to the anti-identitarian crowd. How do you think you're going to convince so many different groups of people to give up their identity? What's your plan?
Now, on Facebook a few days ago, somebody asked me to distinguish a set of individuals from a group. What are the differences between these two concepts? And it was a woman, and she was denying that group identity is a real thing. She was being a clever clogs. So I came up with the following two definitions. A set of individuals. People who might share characteristics, but don't necessarily have any bond with each other, and whose existence is entirely in the present moment. In other words, a set of individuals is a material occurrence, but not a spiritual phenomenon. By contrast, a group. People who share characteristics and have a bond with each other, and can be considered the present iteration of an entity which might have existed in the past and might exist in the future.